On a scorching August morning in Barsalogho, the cries of terrified villagers echoed across the dry fields as they dug trenches, bare-handed and desperate, to defend their homes from an unseen terror. These weren't soldiers. They had no armor, no training, and no certainty of survival. Yet they had been ordered to stand guard, to build defenses, to become human shields in a war they didn't start. Within hours, their fragile hope crumbled when armed militants stormed the village, spraying bullets into the crowd and turning those very trenches into mass graves. Since Captain Ibrahim Traoré seized power in Burkina Faso in late 2022, ordinary citizens have not known a single day of peace. He promised to restore security, to crush terrorism, and to take back the country from chaos. But the people are now paying a price that words cannot measure. Those who once chanted his name as a national hero now whisper doubts in the shadows, asking the question they never thought they'd have to ask. Why are we still dying? From sweeping military campaigns to the rapid deployment of civilian militias known as the VDP, from the rejection of foreign troops to an assertive push for what Traoré calls total security sovereignty, the country has seen change, violent, dramatic, and costly. But has this war on terror truly made life safer? Or has it created a new kind of fear, a new kind of silence, where truth is buried with the dead? In today's video, we take a hard look at President Ibrahim Traoré's anti-terror campaign. We'll explore the human cost, the strategic missteps, and the buried hope still flickering across Burkina Faso. And we'll ask, in the latest Africa news that shakes the region, is this fight for liberation saving a nation or sealing its fate? When Ibrahim Traoré rose to power in 2022, he declared that the very survival of Burkina Faso depended on defeating terrorism, decisively, swiftly, and without compromise. What followed was a military-first approach unlike anything the country had seen. Traoré ramped up efforts to recruit thousands of local volunteers into armed civilian defense units, known as the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, or VDP. These were farmers, traders, and students given basic training and light weapons before being sent into the most dangerous corners of the country. He ordered communities to construct trenches, barricades, and watchtowers with their own hands. In his eyes, this was a revolution of self-reliance, a path to national sovereignty where citizens didn't wait for foreign help, but took matters into their own hands. Foreign military forces, particularly those from France, were expelled, and security partnerships with Western nations were either suspended or heavily scrutinized. Rumors swirled about quiet collaborations with Russia's Wagner Group, though the government denied any official relationship. Traoré made one thing clear: Burkina Faso would not be a pawn in the global game. It would fight its own battles, on its own soil with its own blood. In the early months, there were glimmers of success. In operations like Capidougou, Burkinabè forces pushed back extremist groups from strategic regions such as Bouclé du Mouhoun and Toué. Roads that had been closed for months were reopened, allowing food, medicine, and aid to reach isolated communities. Some towns welcomed the return of government forces with cautious relief. At rallies, Traoré appeared in military fatigues, speaking not from behind a podium, but in the dust among his people, promising victory, justice, and a new beginning. His message resonated with many, especially the youth, tired of foreign meddling and national shame. But beneath the surface of these victories lay a dangerous reality. The lines between combatants and civilians were beginning to blur. As VDP units multiplied, so did accusations of abuse, lack of discipline, and ethnic targeting. These were not trained soldiers but everyday citizens, often carrying trauma and resentment, now armed with power and a license to kill. In many areas, especially those with Fulani populations, wrongly stereotyped as sympathetic to jihadist groups, reports of summary executions, torture, and mass reprisals began to emerge. The government promised investigations, but rarely provided results. International observers grew increasingly alarmed, and human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch raised red flags about the path Burkina Faso was taking. One defining moment came in early 2025 during the massacre in Barsalogho. After weeks of warnings, villagers were ordered to build defensive trenches to protect their homes. They worked day and night, believing they were part of something greater, a national resistance against evil. But when the militants came, they were too many, too fast, and too brutal. Dozens were slaughtered in minutes. Survivors told stories of neighbors dying while still clutching shovels and sandbags. And in the days that followed, instead of receiving support, the community was accused by government forces of harboring terrorists. Several men were taken away. They never returned. It was a pattern that began repeating itself across the country. In Traoré, Diapaga, Nondin, and Soro, violence came not just from extremist groups, but from within, from soldiers and militias sworn to protect the people. Traoré's administration responded with denials, deflections, and occasional promises of reform. But for many on the ground, the war on terror had become a war without a clear enemy, one where every side brought fear, and no one brought safety. Still, to Traoré's supporters, the president remains a symbol of national dignity. They argue that the international community failed Burkina Faso for years, and only now, when the country fights back on its own terms, does the world cry foul. They see the VDP not as a militia but as a grassroots army, a return of power to the people. They believe that, though painful, this fight is necessary to cleanse the nation of decades of corruption, dependency, and infiltration. But for others, especially the victims and their families, the question is no longer whether Ibrahim Traoré is strong enough to lead the war, but whether he's still willing to protect the people he swore to serve. The true turning point in Ibrahim Traoré's war on terror came not from a military defeat, but from a human tragedy too massive to ignore. In March 2025, two villages, Nondin and Soro, woke up to the sound of gunfire, not from terrorists, but from their own supposed protectors. That morning, soldiers and VDP members, allegedly acting on intelligence reports of terrorist collaboration, descended on these peaceful communities and carried out one of the most brutal mass killings in Burkina Faso's recent history. Over 100 civilians, including women and children, were gunned down in their homes, in fields, and even in makeshift shelters where families had sought refuge. Eyewitnesses described horrifying scenes. Toddlers shot at point-blank range, elderly men dragged from their huts, pregnant women left bleeding in the open. These were not casualties of war. These were executions, carried out in the name of national security. International outcry was swift. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the United Nations released urgent statements calling for immediate, independent investigations. The United States State Department expressed deep concern and urged the Traoré administration to uphold the rule of law and protect civilians at all costs. France, already estranged from Burkina Faso's military government, called the massacre a stain on the conscience of the Sahel. But within Burkina Faso, the official response was silence, then deflection. Government spokespeople labeled the reports exaggerations, suggesting that misinformation campaigns were being used to destabilize the country. No official investigation was launched, and no arrests were made. Traoré himself remained mostly quiet, issuing only a brief statement weeks later promising to review operational procedures. For many, it was too little, too late. The image of Traoré, the young, charismatic leader who once walked barefoot with villagers and vowed to fight for justice, began to crack. He no longer looked like a liberator. He looked like another man of power willing to sacrifice his people to maintain control. This was not just a tragedy. It was a betrayal. But the most devastating part wasn't the massacre itself. It was what came after. Survivors were left without aid. Villages emptied out, fields went untended, and hundreds fled to nearby towns where they were met with suspicion instead of shelter. The trauma spread like wildfire, eroding what little trust remained between citizens and the forces meant to protect them. People began to fear not just the jihadists hiding in the bush, but the men in uniform patrolling their streets. For elderly villagers, the war felt like a curse that would never lift. For the young, it bred either resentment or radicalization, fertile ground for extremist groups to recruit and grow stronger. Amid this chaos, the international media began to shine a harsh light on the contradictions of Traoré's leadership. Major outlets questioned how a government that silenced journalists, banned foreign reporters, and dissolved its independent electoral commission could claim to be fighting for freedom and sovereignty. Was this war truly about defeating terrorism, or was it a cover for consolidating power and crushing dissent? In April 2025, Burkina Faso suspended several prominent international news agencies, including Le Monde Afrique, accusing them of undermining national security. For many observers, it was the final confirmation that Traoré's war on terror had morphed into a war on accountability. Still, within Burkina Faso, public opinion remains divided. Some continue to believe that these extreme measures are necessary, that the country is under siege and must act decisively. They point to past governments' failures, to the West's empty promises, and to the rising tide of terrorism across West Africa as proof that only a strong hand can bring peace. Others, however, fear that the longer this war continues unchecked, the more it will resemble the very violence it claims to fight. With every new burial, every unanswered cry for justice, the line between protector and predator grows thinner. The international community now stands at a crossroads. If they push too hard, they risk driving Burkina Faso further into isolation and instability. If they stay silent, they become complicit in a tragedy that history will not forget. And for the people on the ground, especially those in villages like Nondin, Soro, and Barsalogho, the question remains heartbreakingly simple. Who is fighting for us? As the war on terror raged on, its civil and political costs began to pile up, not just in broken homes and empty villages, but in the very structure of Burkina Faso's fragile democracy. One of the first signs came in mid-2025, when President Ibrahim Traoré's government officially dissolved the country's independent electoral commission. The justification? To prevent foreign interference and ensure what they called electoral integrity. The real result? The power to oversee future elections was transferred directly to the Ministry of Territorial Administration, an agency tightly controlled by the military. It was a quiet shift, but a devastating one, and for many Burkinabè citizens, it confirmed a deepening fear. Democracy was no longer on pause, it was being rewritten. This political maneuver came just weeks after the country's transitional charter was amended, granting Traoré the right to stay in power until 2029. Initially installed as a temporary leader with a promise to restore democratic order, he now stood as the de facto head of a military regime with no clear endpoint. In speeches, he insisted this extension was necessary to stabilize the country. But on the ground, people began to question whether stability had simply become a euphemism for unchecked authority. With every new decree, the space for dissent grew smaller. Journalists were arrested, opposition leaders silenced, and public gatherings heavily monitored or banned outright. What started as a campaign to defend Burkina Faso against terrorists was evolving into a system designed to suppress internal dissent. For ordinary citizens, the consequences were immediate and personal. In rural areas, entire communities were being uprooted. Over 2 million people internally displaced by violence, according to humanitarian agencies. Families fled not just from jihadists, but from the threat of being caught between two fires, extremists on one side and government-aligned militias on the other. Women and girls were particularly vulnerable. In displacement camps, stories emerged of gender-based violence, often unreported and unresolved. Access to healthcare, education, and clean water plummeted. The social fabric of entire provinces unraveled as trust between neighbors, tribes, and even families began to erode. Ethnic divisions deepened too. The Fulani community in particular bore the brunt of suspicion. Frequently accused of harboring extremists, they became scapegoats in government narratives and targets in vigilante reprisals. In villages like Solenzo and Diapaga, entire Fulani households were massacred after local militias claimed they had aided jihadist groups. These acts were rarely investigated, and officials often turned a blind eye. This ethnic profiling didn't just harm the victims, it undermined any remaining efforts to build cohesive, cross-community resistance to extremism. If anything, it fed the very forces the government claimed to be fighting. For many young Fulani men, watching their families suffer and their futures disappear, radical ideologies began to feel less like a threat and more like an answer. The legal system offered no recourse. Under Traoré's leadership, courts were sidelined in favor of military tribunals. Cases of abuse or misconduct by security forces were either dismissed or buried. The concept of civilian oversight, a cornerstone of any functioning democracy, was treated as an inconvenience at best and a threat at worst. NGOs that attempted to report on human rights violations faced harassment, office closures, or expulsion from the country. Meanwhile, the state-controlled media continued to promote narratives of unity, progress, and national pride, painting Traoré as a bold, visionary leader reshaping the future of Africa. Yet beneath the surface, fear had replaced faith. People no longer spoke freely, even in private. Local leaders refused to challenge the government, lest they be labeled enemies of the state. In some towns, schools remained closed for years, not just because of insecurity, but because teachers had fled or refused to teach under an administration they no longer trusted. The war on terror had become a war on truth, and Burkina Faso was becoming a nation in quiet retreat from democracy, from dignity, and from itself. By late 2025, whispers began to grow louder. Questions that had once been taboo were now muttered in markets and on dusty back roads. Has the cost of this fight become too high? Are we still fighting to be free, or just fighting to survive? In the name of national security, has our nation been handed over to fear? From Washington to Geneva, Ibrahim Traoré's military regime has become both a cautionary tale and a diplomatic headache. For the United States, Burkina Faso occupies a critical position in the Sahel, a region increasingly seen as a front line in the global fight against terrorism. American military and intelligence services have long relied on regional partnerships to track extremist groups, disrupt recruitment networks, and maintain some semblance of stability. But Traoré's hardline stance, especially his rejection of Western military presence, has complicated these efforts. The expulsion of French forces, the decline in diplomatic transparency, and the possibility of Russian involvement have raised alarms across U.S. strategic circles. In public statements, the U.S. Department of State has walked a careful line. While condemning human rights abuses and calling for accountability, they've stopped short of direct confrontation. Sanctions have been discussed but not enacted. Humanitarian aid continues, but under tight restrictions. Behind closed doors, officials express concern that pushing too hard could drive Burkina Faso further into isolation, or worse, into the open arms of actors like the Wagner Group, whose influence has grown steadily in neighboring Mali and the Central African Republic. The U.S. finds itself trapped between principles and pragmatism. How do you support democratic values without undermining counterterrorism operations? At the United Nations, Burkina Faso's behavior has also sparked debate. Repeated reports of civilian massacres, ethnic violence, and press suppression have led to resolutions and urgent appeals, yet few tangible consequences. For many African observers, this double standard is nothing new. They point out that when Western-backed governments commit abuses, the international response is tepid. But when African nations chart their own path, especially one critical of former colonial powers, they face swift condemnation. This perception has fueled a nationalist rhetoric within Burkina Faso, where Traoré is increasingly portrayed as a David standing up to the Goliaths of the world. Still, beyond politics, the people suffer. And for global audiences, especially Americans watching from afar, the question becomes deeply personal. What is our role in this unfolding crisis? Is it enough to condemn from a distance? Or must we reimagine what solidarity looks like in a post-colonial world still haunted by its past? In just a few short years, The promise of a safer, stronger Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré has unraveled into a painful reality, one marked not by peace, but by fear. What began as a mission to liberate the people from terror has, for many, become a cycle of violence, silence, and loss. The war on terror was supposed to protect the innocent. But when mothers bury their children in government-dug trenches, when elders flee their ancestral homes, and when truth itself is treated like a threat, we must ask, who is truly being defended? To some, Traoré still represents hope, a leader who dared to break free from foreign control and declare sovereignty in a region long overlooked and exploited. But for others, especially the families in Barsalogho, Soro, and Nondin, his rule feels less like liberation and more like betrayal. Promises of justice have faded into whispers. The voices of victims are drowned by official slogans, and the world, once attentive, now watches in silence or looks away entirely. This is no longer just a Burkinabè crisis. It is a moral reckoning for us all. For Americans who have seen our own country grapple with the balance between security and civil rights, the story unfolding in Africa echoes a truth we know too well. Unchecked power, no matter how well-intentioned, always comes at a cost. The question now is not just about Burkina Faso, or even Ibrahim Traoré. It's about what kind of future we are willing to tolerate in the name of safety. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or should he be held accountable for the suffering that continues under his watch? Should the people of Burkina Faso be forced to choose between fear and freedom? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré, but also one of the first to demand truth, transparency, and justice. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines, and that the people of Africa deserve more than just silence from the world.